Hallo Freunde, wir sind spät, because, I don't know, we had another meeting. And yeah, welcome to .NET API Review. Short session today. As I said, we were all in some other meeting, and I don't know why the calendar's not working. Emo, that's your bug. Alright, jumping right in. Uh, Diagnostic method information 906528.
I can talk about this one. Do you want to read it first, or should I read it?
We don't care about the background, let's just talk about the type.
Okay, so this is a proposal for diagnostic method information class. The purpose of the class is basically to be able to get some diagnostic information about trimmed or AOT compiled apps in situations where we currently only have reflection APIs. So currently, if you have a delegate and you want to know what method is it pointing to and like what is the containing type, you can use reflection APIs. We mark one class of these APIs as trim unsafe. That's for the stack trace case. Kind of stack trace APIs allow you to reflect on any part of the program at any time, basically, because you can just grab a stack trace at any time and then ask questions about what is the containing type, what is the method, or what custom attributes are there on the method, stuff like that. We mark it as trim unsafe because we might not have all the information. So in a trimmed app, we would strip parameter names, for example, and this would cause differences in behavior between debug time and like trimmed published app. In AOT app, we can go ahead and trim even more stuff, not just the parameter names. So we trim like custom attributes. We trim most of the metadata. We basically only have the name. So this is a proposal for an API that would allow you to get more restricted information. So instead of the full method info that has everything, you only get names. I have a couple of examples that like people are doing it. They currently don't have a way to do it in a trimmed app. Usually they will just get null spec instead of something useful. And with this API, they could at least get the name. It would be pretty reliable. It wouldn't be like maybe we have the method info, maybe we don't have it, maybe it's damaged, maybe it's not damaged, who knows. So there's a proposal for those scenarios.
All right, so my biggest question, aside from the syntax error right here, is why we like. Is it important that these be extension methods at all, or should they just be static create methods off of the type?
So my motivation for extension method was that there is already a get method info extension method on delegate, so it felt like similar. I don't have strong opinion otherwise.
Because to hand wave a whole bunch of guidelines together into one thing, it's don't make extension methods unless you have to. And
yeah, it doesn't have to be.
But I'm curious what others think in this case.
I like to put it on the class itself instead of extension method, just to be easy to discover. I mean,
All right, so Tarek thinks move to static create.
yes.
I mean, it's a bit weird if they're 1 second. All right, let's try this again. So only one mic. Otherwise I hear myself delayed by 100 milliseconds, which is very annoying. So it's a bit weird if you do that though, because if you have, let's say you have a static method on stack frame that says stack frame get diagnostic info for stack frame, seems almost like it should be an instance method. but I don't think you get to do this on delegates would be my guess, because they're special, which now means you have this weird thing in the middle where for some people it's a static method, for some other things it's an instance method, which I'm not sure you want either.
I'm at here on diagnostic method info.
Oh, so you just okay, I guess that works, yeah. Yeah, then they're all in one place. I think that would be okay.
All right, and then
I mean, it's a bit unfortunate that, it's a brand new type. People need to know that it's there. They have no way of discovering it from an existing type, but
okay, and then so speaking of the discoverability, should instead of diagnostic method info, it be method diagnostic info? So then it sorts pretty near method info. Though I guess method info is in reflection and this is in diagnostics. But if you have that all namespaces feature thing on, then they'd be together.
I'm of two minds here. Like, I think method diagnostic info just reads odd, because I think the intent of this is that this is the method info for diagnostics. So I think having method diagnostic info seems a bit awkward, I think, but
well,
I mean, the sorting is important, but I think, yeah, you said it's in different namespaces, so they would never be on one page, so they would never show up next to each other no matter what.
Right. Well, because it's interesting, because looking at it, I don't feel that it's diagnostics for a method info. I feel like it's diagnostic info for a method. Because it doesn't take a method info anywhere.
Fair enough.
Which is why, to me, the first two words should be flipped. But if nobody feels
Sure.
strongly, then it's a concern, not a...
How is this different from what we have in reflection namespace in general? About like, why this is not in the reflection namespace?
So the intent of this is diagnostic scenarios. It's not a reflection API, because maybe it's reflection, but you cannot really do the same things that you would do with reflection, because for reflection we have method base, method info, those things like that's reflection. You can call it, you can inspect it further. This is really just names. That's why I felt diagnostics sounds like a better namespace. Could be reflection too.
So are you saying that we can reach the same information from reflection, right?
Yes. Like this is, we have existing APIs on delegates. We have delegate.get method info extension method, or delegate.method, not extension method, but a property, which give you the information about the method, but in like the reflection sense. So you get method base or method info, and then you can do stuff with it. You can look at custom attributes. You can invoke it if you want. You can do anything that reflection allows. Similarly, for the stack frame case, stack frame has a dot method property that gives you the reflection method, and you can go and invoke it if you want. This one is kind of more constrained to just diagnostic scenarios, so you can get at most a name. You can still get a null if someone configured the whole app to strip this information, but it's just a name. If you wanted to invoke, you cannot invoke. If you wanted to inspect more, get custom attributes, you cannot do that, because the purpose is really just to give the limited view that is for diagnostics usually. At least like the scenarios that I collected, there are some examples of existing libraries that currently use the reflection APIs, therefore are not trim safe, or come with extra size constraints. with this API, we could switch them to be trim safe or to not have those size implications that we currently have.
All right, and then I asked in email, since it's declaring type name, should that use the new type name? But I think the answer was layering, that this is core lib and that's in metadata.
Yes.
Okay.
And also from the examples that I have, it didn't seem like people would need to structurally inspect the type, which type name allows you more structurally inspect it. Here you just get some string that you can log somewhere.
Okay. So just making sure we hit the things. We asked diagnostics versus reflection. Does anybody want to push aggressively either way? Not pushing means it stays in diagnostics.
I'm just wondering about like this will be in the core lab, right? I mean, implemented in core lab. Okay, I was just wondering about like because I see it's useful also to support it in down levels. I mean, net standard or whatever. But no strong opinion about it.
I mean, I think almost everything we do is useful down level, but
Yeah,
our default stance is no. And since this is for trimming, it up level only seems
most
to
of
make
the
sense.
time, most of the time, diagnostic stuff we supported down levels. I mean, like we have the system diagnostic source library, which is include most of the diagnostic stuff, which is we try to support down levels because like most of the diagnostic scenarios, I mean, people like OpenTelemetry or something like this, they are using it in down levels. I mean, but as I mentioned, about no strong opinion about that, but I was just wondering about it.
I mean, what's the implementation of those? Is it just using reflection, and the value of using this API over reflection yourself is that you don't get warnings, or is it specially implemented to bypass reflection?
So on some runtimes we could just implement it using reflection. On native IoT, we definitely cannot implement it with reflection because we cannot get the method info to begin with. So for native IoT, implementation will be special. For others, in IL sense, as long as we are operating on IL, we can get some method info. It might just be damaged. Like that's the thing, that kind of the method info is damaged. So we need to warn when accessing it. Here we would suppress the warning because we know that we are not touching the damaged parts. We are touching the working parts.
I mean, so is the implementation then something you can OOP at all, or is this some special runtime call anyway that you can't easily OOP?
You can using reflection APIs. So
I see.
That's the thing, that the reflection API will generate a trimming warning, and then you have to make a decision whether it's safe to suppress. In Corlib, we will be able to safely suppress it because Corlib versions with trimmer and so forth. So kind of we can always make sure it works.
I mean, so just to dial back a little bit to it, I think it would make sense to OOP it if one, we can actually implement it as an OOP, and B, if we think that libraries are commonly using it, because then the value add is for people that target .NET 8, .NET 9, and so on, and enable trimming, because then the libraries won't produce warnings, right? But if it's an OOP, and then the OOP is basically like treated as user code because it's part of the output directory, and will produce warnings anyway, then OOPing this thing doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Unless we special case it somehow anyway. But yeah, I mean, to the point earlier, we only OOP in there is value add, right? But if the value add is, hey, library authors, please use this thing, so if people use your library that don't get trimmer warnings, then arguably that would be a good thing. But it's also debatable whether OOPing this one type is worth it, right?
So in general, for trimming and IoT, we have not been ubbing things. Like even the trimming annotation APIs are only in .NET 5 or 6 or wherever. We haven't placed them in somewhere where you could use it from framework. So people always have to polyfill it. That's pretty much all the time when we introduce new like trim or AOT stake APIs. We haven't thought about down level.
Yeah, I mean, that's this conversation we should have at some point. I think the debate then is, does it make sense to have an U package for Net Standard 2 so that Net Standard 2 libraries are nicely trimmable? Because that's basically where I think a third of the popular NuGet packages are today. But I think the value here is not down level, right? The value is just to have a library ecosystem that is trimmer friendly. And then if there's more than one type, then I think ubbing makes sense. Just ubbing this one type, I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, the API is something that you could polyfill if you want. Like that's it's not the non-ALT version is not difficult to implement as a polyfill.
And then the suppression is basically just a custom attribute applied to this thing.
Yes, but hopefully you wouldn't suppress for something that targets like .NET 9 or anything, because you don't want to be using the reflection implementation on native AOT, basically. Like if we end up using the reflection implementation on native AOT, then the suppression is illegal.
Yeah, so the polyfill will basically have an if-def that says only if you're not targeting net 9 or later, then you get the polyfill implementation, right?
Only for like net standard. Like even you cannot really polyfill for .NET 8. Like the more I think about, like if someone wants to use this on .NET 8, it wouldn't work with AOT. And if they suppress a trimming warning in there, then like the suppression would be illegal for .NET 8. So we probably cannot do ubbit.
I think it can be done like what we did with a time provider. I mean, like, so the implementation is inside curlib, and we have a polyfill, which is like the library build for .NET Core. It will just type forward to whatever. And if it is down level, I mean, it will have the polyfill, the actual implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the specific concern is if someone uses it for .NET 8.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. It will be type forward to the core lib.
But .NET 8 doesn't have it in core lib. So .NET 8 already shipped, so we would use the reflection-based implementation, and that would be an illegal trimming warning suppression if we suppress a trimming warning in there.
Yeah, you are right.
Yeah, so it sounds like we can't really ubbit then due to an implementation problem, in which case the discussion is basically moot. So, anything else, or should we just approve it now?
Yeah, so we're good with diagnostics, and then we discussed DMI and MDI, and are we keeping DMI?
Either way works for me. I don't have strong opinions.
Alright. Nobody feels strongly, so what was proposed wins. Alright. So that is the oh, and this parameter was called del in the proposal, and I changed it to delegate.
It's a keyword though, but add for the win.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you, Diagnostic Method Info. Next up, add a JSON schema exporting component for system text JSON contracts 102788.
Okay, I can speak to that. This is I guess, the culmination of many other API proposals we added to system text JSON this year. The previous ones were mostly of infrastructural nature, and this is kind of the actual thing that we want to build. So this year we received many requests from both internal and external partners asking for some way for system text JSON to expose a JSON schema document that describes how a particular contract is meant to be represented. Specifically, I think I should nominate Semantic Kernel as well as Copilot. They've wanted this for the function calling capability that certain LLMs have. And also it's been a requirement for the Microsoft Open API initiative that's currently happening. So a few months back, I wrote a prototype a project that targets the 8.0 version of system text JSON. However, that ended up requiring a lot of reflection to be able to work. This is effectively porting these APIs in the prototype that are currently being used within Semantic Kernel and Microsoft Open API into something that will be shipped with system text JSON proper. Maybe for a bit of background, this will effectively be taking a JSON type info as input. A JSON type info is effectively the object that describes the JSON contract for a given type, and it will be mapping out a JSON schema document that will be encoded as a JSON node object. A JSON node being the mutable JSON DOM that we use in system text JSON. So there will not be a JSON schema exchange type being released, at least in .NET 9. At this point, we will just be targeting JSON node, and the relevant APIs have been annotated as such. So the other thing is that one of the key invariants that we want this exporter to satisfy is that for every serialization output that's being produced by a particular contract, or for whatever JSON is being accepted by a particular contract, the generated schema should be able to validate that JSON and vice versa. Sorry, Mo?
Yeah, so one question I have is, so when you say JSON node, it's basically the DOM that represents the JSON that is basically whatever the JSON representation for the schema is?
Correct. So it's just a syntactic representation as a plain old JSON document. There is nothing specifically JSON schema. It will be an opaque representation that users can just use as is or map to exchange types that they own for particular variations of JSON schemas.
And that's the mutable DOM that we return here, right? That's
Correct.
right? And
Correct.
we don't need a writer API, a reader API that is like less allocatey.
I don't believe there's been such a requirement so far. It would just be producing a mutable JSON DOM, mostly because there is a requirement to be able to modify these individual nodes in the schema, in the schema document. For example, by appending custom attribute annotations that are important in a particular application. So no.
Gotcha. And Sophia is typing. She probably has something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to share that for OpenAPI. ASP.NET Core provides the semantics for reading and writing the JSON node type when we materialize it into our own exchange type. And that's because depending on what version of the OpenAPI specification we target, that serialization might look different. So I think it's sufficient for the consumers of the API to dictate how the opaque JSON node gets written based on whatever their requirements are.
Because they basically just hit the URL and you are responsible for giving them whatever they're asking for in the content type, right? Which is wire anyway, right? Not an object model.
Yeah.
And then the other question I had is, so I don't remember enough details about the JSON type info thing, but are they sufficiently self-described, or isn't there still some sort of like Uber serialization options that might change the behavior of how the type is being serialized?
So the JSON type info instance should encapsulate all information necessary for a value being serialized. It encapsulates JSON serializer options. It encapsulates everything. It's pretty much a self-describing token.
And then what's the difference between the two? With the JSON serializer options, you basically pass in the type?
Yeah, so the first overload is basically just an accelerator. You give it an options, you give it a type, and then you look up the JSON type info corresponding to that given type that has been registered within the particular options.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But the workhorse is the second overload, really.
Is that going to finish the options? Like, make it read-only, no longer modifiable?
Yep.
So, to my extension methods question mark, I like that this is set up for a nice static call already. With this being an extension method on serializer options, I think, unless getTypo already does seal it, this looks like the first method that would seal it.
So there are a bunch of methods. So the methods themselves don't mark these objects read-only, but it does call into other methods that mark it read-only. So these methods aren't touching anything. They aren't touching internal state, but by virtue of exercising JSON serializers.getTypeInfo or JSON serializer option JSON type info dot make read-only, they make it so. I'm not sure if that distinguishes makes this any different.
Well, I'm just saying the cases that we have right now, when a JSON serializer options gets passed to something, like you see that you're passing it as an argument, that's when it effectively hits make read only. And but this one, if you call it using extension syntax, you've called a get, and then this get happened to have a side effect of making it read only. And so I personally think that's a little surprising if the current getTypo doesn't already do that.
Yeah, honestly, I don't mind making these statics. They wouldn't be used a lot. Like, it's typically framework authors, library authors that would be exercising these APIs in the first place.
And presumably getTypeInfo is the same as calling make read only, right?
So getTypeInfo doesn't necessarily make the options instance read only. It can give you it has this behavior where if it's not marked read only, it will give you an uncached mutable instance that you can modify to your own liking.
Interesting. Yeah, if we don't have any instance members today that are public that cause it to be sealed, I don't think that means we can't do it. It's just should give us some pause and think about that we want that behavior. I mean, personally, I'm fine with saying, there are certain types where if you query them in a certain way, they implicitly seal. So long the operation itself kind of implies that. I think, to me, asking for a schema is kind of saying, I expect it to be final at this point, because otherwise your schema is not going to be valid anyway. So I think that wouldn't be the worst in the world.
Yeah, these methods are saying, look, I'm going to traverse the type graph. So,
yeah. That being said, I don't think that people will. I think so. The only really commonly used type here is JSON serializer options. I think JSON type info is you're already in the weeds where you fuck with the schema of JSON, which most people won't, unless you extend it or unless you do some source generation yourself, I guess. So I think having that as an instance method seems fine. JSON serializer options is a bit more of a core type that people use a lot. Maybe that's a bad idea to make it an instance method, but it's also not the worst. So I think I'm fine with having them as extension methods as well. But I don't think it's a common scenario to having to promote it as that. So we could just start with them as factories, static, and then make them extension methods later if we really wanted to.
Yeah, sounds good to me. So I guess the other thing, continuing the description of these methods, I've named them getJSON schema as node, and this is because we are anticipating an exchange type being released sometime in the future, and in which case we would have methods named getJSON schema.
Yep.
Continuing, the exporting logic accepts a new options object, which is the second type being described in this proposal. It is a sealed class. It is an immutable class, so all the properties are init-only properties. It exposes the default as a singleton static, and then individual instances currently expose 3 options. So allow schema references is a flag that controls whether $ref properties should be allowed within the schema. If you set it to false, of course, you risk getting a nice exception if you're generating the schema for recursive types, like linked lists or trees. Then there's the JSON schema exporter compatibility mode, which is a bit of a mouthful. But effectively, that governs the default behavior when it comes to resolving nullability annotations and the requiredness of constructor parameters. Now, if you recall, a couple of weeks back, we reviewed a couple of proposals in System.json that anticipated this change, where we decided to add feature flags that change the requiredness of constructor parameters and that changes whether the serializer honors nullability annotations on properties. Initially, we decided to make these the default behavior, but because we had lots of failing tests that give a signal that it would be both of these changes would be incurring breaking changes, we don't want to do that in the serializer. But at the same time, it's a good default behavior for the schema exporter. So the compatibility mode enum basically has 2 options. One is called strict, which is the default, and that means always honor nullability annotations, always mark constructor parameters as required. It is slightly stricter compared to what the serializer allows, regardless of what runtime settings have been set in that particular JSON serializer options. And then there's the second option, which is JSON serializer, and that means use whatever defaults are being specified in that particular JSON serializer options.
So one comment on this, I think you might set yourself up for failure, because right now you basically say strict includes nullability and parameter requiredness, right? But then what happens if we add another language feature down the road? Do we then have stricter? Like at some point we just run out of things, right? So it might make more sense to just make them individual things you can set, like nullability annotations, yes, no, constructor parameter requiredness, yes, no. I don't know what else we had, required members, yes, no, right? The only downside by doing that is, you have more combinatorics, but adding new things to it is pretty straightforward, right? And then the other downside is it might be harder to describe, like, okay, what does the serializer do? But I'm not sure we care that much. I think people that use this type, they need to know what they use the schema for, and I'm not sure that choosing between strict and JSON serializer is necessarily easier, right? They would have to understand what the requirements are that they generate out of.
Yeah, the sole reason why this option exists, it could have been optional because we have flags for both in the main JSON serializer options type, and we could just have the exporter echo whatever exists there. The problem with that is that, if users haven't taken action to, respect nullability annotations and require constructor parameters in the generated OpenAPI document, you would have nulls everywhere, and
right.
That didn't feel like a nice default. I'm not sure.
By the way, I'm not saying you should just use the serializer options. I'm just saying instead of having this combined compat mode enum, you just have them as individual options, maybe even directly on the options type. Because I'm saying, like, if we add 1 more or 3 more, then we have strict, stricter, most strict. Like that's
I mean, we could do that. I think the problem that remains in that case is what what happens with the default value in the options, because we add like a third dimension. Would we be able to just update the default value of compatibility mode, or would that third stricter option necessarily require opt-in in this layer as well?
Right,
So I
but
guess your third mode is just inherit from whatever the JSON serializer options are. So you
Sorry,
said
could you
there's
repeat
three
that?
modes. There's on, off, and honor the serializer, right? This is your third state.
No, I was saying, like, suppose that we add some third dimension in the future. So currently it's allowability annotations and constructor parameters. Suppose there's a hypothetical third.
Yeah.
You know, that would give us flexibility to add that as an additional flag in this enum, but it wouldn't let us set this as the default because you know, it might be considered a breaking change.
I mean, I think it would be just like with the serializer stuff of you would add it as a new Boolean and you would decide if you can set it to true or false. It could be that there's an entirely new thing that wasn't capable of expressing before and you get to really have an opinion, or you can say we think this was marginal, but it's better to leave the option that somebody can turn it back off, but we're going to change the default, or you know, whatever. But yeah, I think that this enum sounds like it's setting things up for expansion, but I think it's actually super limiting, and it should be individual properties, even though it means they'll be defined on the JSON serializer and the source generator thing and here. And
so one thing to note is that the return document, it's, you know, it is a JSON document, but it is kind of opaque. Opaque in the sense that the schema that's being generated, it doesn't subscribe to a particular draft version of the JSON schema specification. It very intentionally avoids doing that because we know that the specification is still under flux. So there's no, for example, there's no $schema property being generated at the root document. Like, we leave that responsibility to the caller to kind of ascribe whatever semantics they want to the thing on their side. But generally speaking, this targets kind of the basis of, you know, JSON schema core syntax, core vocabulary. So, you know, this compatibility mode this enum doesn't necessarily mandate strict behavior. It's mostly a switch that tunes where the user basically specifies, do you want something that is faithful to the serializer, or do you want something that, you know, looks nice in Swagger? I think that's kind of the spirit of this setting. So even if a third setting was to be added in the future, I personally wouldn't mind including that by default, if that makes sense. I
see. So I guess based on how you led the conversation, I guess that means for the serializer, we don't enforce certain things, but then presumably ASP.NET and OpenAPI want that if you look at the Swagger, it says this field is required, so you want to honor nullability annotations there. So you want to have strict as the default. Yeah. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's basically the idea.
So that's also, but then, yeah, I guess then the question becomes is if we add this hypothetical third thing, is that a breaking change? Because I mean, I would imagine that if you actually use it as an API, you know, I mean, not use API in our normal sense, but like for a web API kind of scenario, I would imagine that if we ever add a JSON schema type, we would add validation support as well, and then people actually use it to validate their incoming data, in which case it would become a breaking change, right? Or might become a breaking change, right? Depending on how you hold it. So yeah, I mean,
but the problem would be when the third dimension comes in, which we'll call elephant because it won't be that. We'll end up with strict and JSON serializer, and you'll be like, oh, but I want the nullability thing, but I don't want the elephant. So then you'll get strict JSON serializer, strict no elephant, and JSON serializer with elephant, and so then we should have just had them as bools.
So the escape hatch in that case would be, if the third thing gets added, it will have a corresponding Boolean on the JSON serializer options. So in that case, you would say, okay, I want to mix and match, and therefore disable strict, use JSON serializer, but then manually set everything that needs to be set in the JSON serializer options. Does that make sense? Like,
Why can't we do this here already?
So basically reflect the booleans that exist in the options here.
Yeah, I mean, like, so we could say, you know, the JSON set of the options that you get today would say, you know, down on and nullability annotations, but then you say for the purpose of Swagger, you know, I just take the JSON set of the options, clone them, say honor them, and then that's the options I pass into the JSON schema exporter.
Yeah, I think that would be workable.
Yeah, and I think I had actually misunderstood the JSON serializer compatibility. It's not do what JSON serializer does by default. It's do what the JSON serializer options
Right.
that were
Yeah.
either
Right.
this options or the options that generated this type info do what that says. So
I mean, I would prefer that design because it also gets out of the business of having to keep these suckers in sync, which is already sad between source generator and the other one. So if we could avoid having a third place, that would be nice. But I mean, that's also kind of what I was asking earlier. Like, I would imagine if we do that though, it's probably not super cheap, right? I mean, it's cheap in terms of lines of code, but then behind the scenes, you're cloning entire JSON options, you lose the caches, and then potentially a bunch of objects are being created.
You
right?
would do it once per type, right? So this is definitely not on the code path.
Fair enough. I mean, famous last words, but yeah.
right. So then, regarding the enum, which currently has 2 members, what would a third member of the compatibility mode look like? Because the alternative would be, you know, Boolean use serializer settings, just as a straw man. But
yeah,
I think the
think
proposal that I would have is we don't have it at all. Like, basically, the idea is if you want anything different, like we always honor JSON serializer options. If you don't like them, you modify them before you pass them in.
so you want to get rid of the default being ignore.
I would
the
completely
options.
remove the enum and the property. Yeah, I would just say if you don't like what JSON serializer options does, you change it before you pass it in.
Can you achieve the equivalent of strict, Eric, by creating a custom JSON serializer or custom JSON serializer options?
You could, but again, kind of users would be on the hook to do that in order to get readable Swagger documents. I think that's
is there like we have JSON serializer options .default and JSON serializer options .web. Is there another one we could add there that would be the equivalent of this?
I suppose we could, but I think whether ASP.NET Core adopts that as a default, that's a different question. Yeah, there's a lots of things we could do. I think where this discussion is kind of heading to is, I think I'm hearing people are questioning whether this should be an enum. So perhaps should it be a Boolean, which is basically be opinionated or be compatible. So I think these are the 2 possible states I'm seeing here, and I think trying to insert a third state would be counterproductive, let's say. And the opinionated mode in this case would be use a subset that renders nicely in Swagger. I think that's kind of the high level description of what this would be doing.
I think I'm okay with that. The only thing I don't like is, you know, if we add these as Booleans here, then are we not ending up in a world where we eventually have a lot of overlap between the options? And then we have to remember that we have to add them in 2 places. That's the thing I don't like.
My understanding of his statement, which is what I was asking previously, is we make it like bool generate opinionated schema. True is strict and false is ask the serializer.
I get that. That's current state, right? I'm just saying if you add a third one later, unless you can subsume it under, you know, the true or the false state, then you add up with another property which you now have to name as the feature, which now from now on you basically are in the business of having to keep that in sync, right?
But that one would be you're respecting the feature off the serializer. It makes it weird. Like if we make a, you know, the thing that somebody calls a breaking change from the opinionated mode, they have to do a lot more work to go get their JSON serializer in the right state, but it would still be possible.
So let me then rephrase what you said. You're basically saying you would never ever add new booleans to this type. You would just say, if there's a third thing, now you have to modify the JSON options.
Yeah.
The only concern I have with this plan is like, if like right now we are saying we don't want to do this because it's complicated, right? And so now we are saying, well, but later on we can make that work, right? So that seems a bit like saying, it's inconvenient enough, so we want the opinionated one, but if the new setting also has an opinion, now you're saying, oh no, you have to like custom modify the options, right? So, which is kind of like, whether that holds true then will remain to be seen, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's also Steve's see how long we can go leaving this out before people complain and ask us to add it.
You mean entirely leaving it off, just only honoring the JSON serializer options?
Yep. Put them in the clean mode if you want it in the clean mode.
Yeah, I had a comment here, which is I think for the sake of OpenAPI/Swagger, the strict compatibility mode could theoretically be implemented entirely via the on schema node generated callback, which we haven't discussed yet, but it's a integration point where the callee can modify the schemas that are generated before they're returned. So I don't know if things like the semantic kernel and Copilot are also consumers of the strict mode, but if it's strictly, no pun intended, for the sake of OpenAPI, I think on schema node generated is a reasonable escape hatch if we don't want to include the enum. Did I miss something there, Eric, or do you think that?
No, I think
well?
it's possible in principle, although it pushes some of that responsibility on you to kind of do the manipulation of an untyped schema document. But I would say that even in the context of function calling, gratuitously marking every reference type as nullable, every string, every root level object, everything, I think that dilutes the potency of the advertised schema that is being pushed to the LLM, because, if it starts putting null everywhere, even if, like, clearly based on, this profile designed, there shouldn't be nulls in these properties, and the root object shouldn't be null either. Like, I think that would create problems. So I think it's opinionated mode is actually, in practice, it's useful.
Yeah, by that. I mean, I don't know what the JSON schema looks like, right? But if it's presumably the type representation is going to be more than one simple string. So I would think that if you say you have to modify it on schema generated, well, I think for us, that's also a bad for compat burden, right? Because if we now have to work with the fact that every single partner we have is intercepting that event and then fucks with the JSON schema for the common case, then, well, I don't know how to reason about that then either, right? So, I mean, the whole reason why I think I have concerns with the enum is because of compat down the road. Pushing more work in third parties into, super powerful extension plugin points seems counter to that, I think.
Yeah, I think, like I said, maybe it's the naming I've chosen, but I think this quote-unquote strict mode is a sweet spot when it comes to schematization. It's effectively what users meant when they did this, code first POCO definition. Like, this is how the JSON should look like. And because of historical reasons, we ship JSON serializer to behave a little bit differently, but we can't change that at this point. But we would like this to be the default every time we want to schematize, unless users specify otherwise.
Yeah, I defer to your guys' opinion on this. Is like, my only concern is, as I said, like, what happens if the language evolves, right? Can we always book it under either a strict or JSON serializer with a meaningful default, or are we going to add more settings to this? The answer is no, then I think it's fine. Or if we say use the JSON serializer options, that's also fine by me.
So do we make this a bool?
I mean, I certainly prefer the bool over another type.
As a straw man, can you name it?
Reserve options compatibility. No, I hated that as I uttered the word.
Pretty schema, true false.
Yeah. I think that looks scarier than what that seems scarier than what turning this on actually does. Generally speaking, the use of the word opinionated in the context of software scares me, but yeah.
So out of curiosity, I see here that the default for the Boolean is true. So the default behavior is that will be faithful to the JSON serializer option. Okay.
No,
I think there's.
when I had it
It was
as
a
be
straw man.
opinionated true, and now saying, well, what if it's respect options? So then it's false. I'm going with the
Okay.
notion that you want the thing currently called strict to be true, and then just trying to find what the name of a boolean that seems descriptive and approachable is. So we'll ignore the default, and we'll make it right in the end.
One issue I have with the current name is that 99% the JSON serializer options is being respected, but it's also opting into some things that by default we're too scared to opt into in the default options. So I'm not sure how to put that in a concise.
Yep.
Yeah, just as bro equals true. I think I'll go for that one. I think strict makes sense in this context because, like I said, it generates a stricter subset compared to what is acceptable by default.
I mean, I don't know, like if I were to view this for the first time, I would be like, well, of course you should honor the JSON serializer options, but it's an interesting, yeah.
That's what I mean. The generate opinionated or generate minimal, generate small. Like I don't know. I can't come up with a name for the Boolean, and if we go compatibility mode, then it seems like people are now saying like they see that some people would see strict as do strictly what I said to do on the JSON serializer options, which means that strict isn't a good name for that either. So
yeah, that's Sophia's point in chat as well. I kind of agree with that. Like it, but the funny thing is, in our case, it's the inverse, right? So yeah.
I mean, what if we just went back to using the enum and replaced strict with default? And, what is the default will be specified in XML documentation, and then we'll have JSON serializer as one additional compatibility mode.
Yeah, I guess that works.
Yep. Chat threw in some Boolean names of prefer type information or prefer serializer options. That would either make sense for the Boolean or for the...
I like the preferred type information. It sounds compatible with the spirit of the setting.
So, do we want that over the Boolean? Or, I mean, over the enum?
In general, I prefer a Boolean to an enum, if that means anything.
I don't know what preferred type information means. If it's false, we shouldn't use any of the type information when generating a schema. Like not just about nullable. Everything should just be object. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if the serializer options and the type info give you some conflicting hints, which one do you want to trust more? So it's preferred
But
type
we
information
don't.
over serializer options.
I don't
That's
understand.
that's my best understanding of I'm just relaying things. So I'll stop talking.
So if you have a type info, do you have options? I know the options usually has like a type info resolver. So is this only matter for the options overload?
No, type info always encapsulates an options. So
Okay.
you get that always.
That makes sense.
Somehow I think I'm going back to compatibility mode as a better name compared to what we've seen so far.
Yeah, naming wise, I would agree with you. I think I still prefer the original proposal that I think Jeremy had, where it's just a different JSON serializer defaults.
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Because if you say JSON serializer defaults .web schema, I think it kind of describes what we want to go for here.
But does that mean that everybody would, like, if you have customization, you would make two serializer options, one for generating the schema and one for actually doing your serialization?
Correct.
Yeah, that sucks.
Or most likely you would be updating the setting for everything and using it both for the schema generation and serialization.
Well, that kind of points to that using JSON serializer options or modifying them is actually extremely inconvenient, because you basically have to write an if statement around the very first line, right?
Yep.
Which is not great.
The other thing, of course, is that you might want to specify something in Swagger as not null, but at the same time also tolerate nulls if they're being passed by the user. So kind of forcing the user to set this option in the global JSON serializer options might be undesirable, actually.
Now, this brings us back to maybe there should be different properties on this type. But yes.
All right, so clearly what we do is we take all the properties off of JSON serializer and we put them on here, but make them nullable. So null means use what the serializer said, and otherwise it means I'm an override. Obviously.
I mean, if we don't have JSON serializer defaults, right, it would be reasonable to say you just clone the settings and you set the two things rather than having to reinitialize the entire thing, right? That I think is more reasonable.
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, I think I was being facetious when I said the nullable booleans, but I think it actually solves the problem.
Oh, and V1, yes.
No, because for it would give us this. We'd be defining everything three times: one on JSON serializer options, one on whatever the thing is for the source generator, and then one again here. This one would always be nullable, and the other two would presumably never be nullable, because once they're nullable, we have a problem, because we can't have a nullable. I don't actually like that answer. It just is it will work as a pattern solution. And then us saying that we're opinionated in schema exports is it's nullable, but we've defaulted it to either true or false depending.
I don't know. I think I'm going back to the prospect of just using the enum.
Okay.
We can change strict to default if you wish. That should give us more flexibility. But I would resist any attempts to add a third option here, personally. But, should future maintainer decide to do that, then, by all means.
So what if I want the default behavior and I don't, like, I'm a library and I don't want it to ever change in a future release when us .NET library authors decide that default should be different?
You make a standalone application and you go hide in a cave.
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, like, because you could have, like, default means whatever framework authors think are best, and then something that's more concretely named to be, more what it is today.
Yeah, I mean, so Emo threw a thing in chat, which I'll copy onto the screen so people can see it, which is assuming that this constructor exists, like, be all schema-y isn't go do all your work twice, it's go make a wrapper and set an option or two.
Yeah, that's feasible. Now, the only downside to that is that you would be regenerating all the caches from scratch by virtue of the fact that you're cloning your options, because that creates a new caching context. Isn't as bad in the case of SourceGen, but it would make schema generation substantially less trivial work-wise, a couple of orders of magnitude. Especially for the case of reflection waste. But it is an option. It's a cost you'd be, in ideal circumstances, only be paying once at the startup of your application.
Yep. Because as long as the conversion is as easy as that, then that makes me inclined to go with what I think was the Steve suggestion of we just cut this entirely and say we only respect things off the serializer options.
Safia, would that work for you?
Yeah, I think it's fine if the choice is like some additional complexity in the implementation for the OpenAPI specific stuff, which is like ultimately opaque to users versus shipping an API that we all seem to be not super excited about. We can the former sounds fine.
Yeah. Okay. If we somehow find that this impacts generation performance, we can revisit the possibility of adding a nub, but it might need to be opt-in if we do it too late.
Okay, does this constructor already exist?
The copy constructor, yeah.
Yeah.
And in real life, you'd have to specify a type, right? That was just like pseudocode.
Yeah, because you need that type argument there. All right, so
that's like the root type of the schema.
Gets rid of the compatibility property. And yeah, I mean, let's see how far we can make it. So I want to pop back to this one. Is this necessarily a notion of like a root type, or is it just like any type?
Sorry, say again?
The parameter is called type, and here it's type info. Is there at some point you said root type, and so should this be
right.
root type and root type info, or?
This just follows nomenclature of argument names in the JSON serializer class.
Okay.
So, yeah. I guess that takes us to, the final feature of this component, which is callbacks. So one of the key requirements, especially for the OpenAPI scenario, is to be able to effectively recognize attributes that have been specified across the type graph, extracting information from these additional attributes, and then enriching the generated schema. Some of these attributes are not readable by system.text.json, so they would need to be fetched independently from whoever is calling this API. Initially, what needed to happen was that users would generate the schema and then retraverse the type graph, find the attributes they're interested in, and then kind of join them back into the schema document that had been generated. But given that the schema document is just a dumb JSON document, that's kind of hard to do, actually. So when discussing this with Safia, we kind of came up with this callback approach. Effectively, you can optionally specify an on-schema node generated callback, which actually gives you the mutable JSON object that has been generated for the particular sub-schema within your schema document. And it gives you the type info for the particular node and the property info for the particular node, and maybe path information, and then you can patch it up as you wish. You can resolve for a description attribute. You can perhaps change the $ID URIs or $anchor URIs, all sorts of manipulations that might be necessary to have your schema kind of subscribe to a particular specification. And I have actually a code snippet that shows how this works in practice. If you could scroll down in the API proposal. But effectively, it's this. You specify JSON schema exporter options, and you specify a callback. And in this particular case, it tries to find the description attribute in case it has been specified in the particular JSON property info in that context. And if it has, then it appends the description string specified in the particular description attribute under the description property in that particular JSON schema. And this kind of unblocks arbitrary support for arbitrary attributes, including component model or whatever.
Does this work like bottom up? Like, would you end up seeing like JSON nodes of things that you've already,
it's
like as
first.
children?
Depth first.
It's what? Depth first?
Depth,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the path, is that like a XPath or JSON path kind of thing?
So that's an interesting question. I ended up using a span of string. So you basically, it's giving you kind of the individual breadcrumbs, and you can interpret them as you like or format them as you like, rather than, using JSON path or JSON pointer. So you can actually use that to infer the depth of your particular object as well.
But it's like
Wait,
the property path, and then if it's a collection, it'll be like 7. And
if it's an array, you would have a string representation of an index.
Using like square brackets or something? Like, is it what's the syntax? Sorry.
There is no syntax. So if you were looking into the second element of a JSON array, you would just have a single read-only span of string, whose single element would be 1. And you would be on the hook to kind of interpret that as JSON path or JSON pointer. In JSON pointer, for example, there's no angle bracket notation as such. It would just be, /1 for the second element.
So this is only like the path from the immediate parent. This isn't like path to root.
A path to root.
because it's
it is
not
the full
span
path
of
to
char, it's span of string.
Yeah, read-only span of string. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Which means you're giving like a slice of an array of arbitrary length?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing to note implementation-wise is that a copy of an array needs to be created for each one of these, just to be sure.
And then, yeah, I was looking for, I was seeing if the guidelines said to use or not use the on. This isn't really an event because it's not using the event keyword. If it was an event, the on is the function that triggers the event instead of the event itself. Because as an event, it would just be schema node generated, and then add remove. But this seems consistent enough. We don't have specific, even though it's the pattern we've moved to, we haven't written down guidelines for using delegates in lieu of events. We've just kind of said do it.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So on schema node generated, can you use that to remove like a subtree from the schema, like to remove a property or something from the top level? And how would you do that?
You would call the mutable APIs in JSON object.
Even though it's breadth first, so it's like top down.
Depth
like
first.
It will...
Depth first.
Oh, it's depth first. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, I misheard. Okay.
No worries.
Yeah, it was because it's past tense, so it should only happen when the thing is complete. So
right. So the very last callback will be the root type, basically.
Yeah. So you should be seeing a view of the schema as fully populated by the exporter once the callback is being invoked. So you can move things as well. The other thing perhaps worth mentioning is, I mentioned it in passing before, but it is an immutable class, the options type, and it has init properties. And it should be mentioned that it's a net standard 2.0 library as well. Now, there is prior art. We have the models used by the source generator also have init properties, but these aren't invoked directly by users. But it does set a precedent. At the moment, de facto system.json has a minimum dependency on C# 7.3. Or is it C# 9? Sorry, I forget. But the minimum dependency is whatever version of C# supports init-only properties. Any objections to that?
I mean, I always object to that, but because init properties are a C# syntax, they're not a runtime thing. You can still set them via reflection or IL.
Yeah, I guess I can change the default values using F#.
So they're
I think they've added support for init now.
Yeah, because init's just complicated syntactic sugar. It doesn't actually guarantee what it says.
Yeah, well,
the type is not read-only. It just wishes it was. If you write an IL.
Yeah, I mean, do we expect that people are going to use like reflection to populate this accidentally? And
no, I'm just saying
after you've used it.
I always object to init because it doesn't do what it says it does.
Well,
and it forces you to use an object initializer syntax, so it's just a thing that makes opinionated coding happen on the part of the author or the caller. But
it being language only is also kind of ish. The runtime has support for reflection blocking mutation in some cases, and there's been considerations in the past of blocking things like init post constructor and recognizing when the object has actually been constructed versus when it's not. So it's not necessarily only language sugar, it's just kind of language sugar, and it's undefined behavior to violate it.
I'll say ish on that because my recollection from the runtime and language decision on init was they still used the set slot because they wanted reflection to be able to override the init block.
Right, so that serializers could still
right.
work.
Yeah, they chose to block or to not make it a new slot that wouldn't work.
There's conceptual limits within that where it would be valid for the runtime to recognize. For example, I've called the constructor, I've called the init annotated methods, and now it is actually immutable, and any further mutations that happen after that fact could throw. It's kind of like string create, where the runtime has specialized support for mutating a string if you call this one API in a limited context, but after that API is done, mutating its now undefined behavior and can corrupt your program.
Yep.
This is like hypothetical runtime behavior, though, right? Like the runtime currently doesn't stop you.
Yeah, I don't think we currently stop it. For instances, for static read-only, we do.
From my perspective, I'm happy as long as the type system of the language prevents you to do that. If it makes you go jump through hoops to mutate the singleton, I don't care. You force this on you.
Right. I'm just being very pedantic of the type is not get init does not make a type read only. You can only so considering public reflection to be a thing that is different than private reflection, get init does not block
it's
public reflection.
At the end of the day, it's von Neumann architecture. It's not lambda calculus, so everything is mutable.
Yeah. But the if the library's already used get init anywhere, then hearts are broken and do whatever you want.
All right.
It's basically my feeling. And then this is correct that it's JSON object and not JSON node?
Yeah, that's a good observation. So the return value is JSON node, but ultimately you will always get back a JSON object. Now, per the JSON schema specification, a schema node or a subschema node can either be a JSON object or it can be Boolean. So it can be false or true, and the values false and true represent either a schema that is always invalid or a schema that is always valid. Now, for the purposes of this schema exporter, I intentionally steer clear of using true or false anywhere within the subschema, and the sole motivation behind that is that a JSON node that is false or true is not mutable. So a schema that is always true is just an empty object. A schema that is always false is an object that contains a not true keyword. And that's why this fact is reflected in the callback. It gives you back a JSON object so that you know that you get, you don't need to do unsafe up downcasts. You can just modify the JSON object directly.
Right. So if this is always going to return a JSON node that is a JSON object, why don't we just say it's JSON object?
We could. I think for the purposes of the signature provided by this API, kind of at a high level, you're getting back JSON node. Now, if you're willing to drill down into the whole logic of doing callbacks, it kind of reveals this more specific truth that, actually every single node that's being generated is actually guaranteed to be a JSON object for out of these particular considerations. Now, if that looks weird, what we could do instead is, rather than using an action, we could be using a func, taking a context, taking a JSON node, and then returning another JSON node, so that you can also replace rather than just mutate.
What's the objection to returning a JSON object from a static API that will never return like a true or false JSON node?
No objection, and in fact, I think the prototype also does return JSON object, but we have, like most of the APIs that return JSON node, return JSON node. It kind of, I guess it demarcates that category that, something that deals with JSON node returns JSON node, even though casting to JSON object will always succeed in this case.
Right, because I mean, for parameters, it's take the lowest you expect, and for returns, it's take the strongest you guarantee. And if the implementation is always guaranteeing it's JSON object, we should make the returns be honest.
We can. Should we rename the method as get
Yeah.
JSON schemas object then?
JSON object is a JSON node, so I think it's still fine. It's telling you you're playing in the JSON nodes universe.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought that myself earlier, so I've had a very quick response. And chat has asked, while we're doing this, should we add the JSON serializer defaults dot schema?
No, because that wouldn't work with SourceGen. Like any JSON serializer options that is a singleton by definition only works with reflection. This particular component should work with any source, whether it's source generated or reflection based.
Does the
So I think
SourceGen not have the notion of start me with the web defaults?
it does, but you need to pass it through the copy constructor and then feed it some source generated context. Or you could specify it via the JSON source generation options attribute, which the source generator recognizes, and it kind of fills in the web defaults into the object. I think I understand. Like we could have a new JSON serializer defaults, I guess, that bakes in the requiredness and nullability annotation things as a built-in behavior. I think we could do that.
Yeah, that was the.
I think that's a different API proposal though, unless we want to deal with it now. We're over time.
Yeah, I mean, if we think it makes sense for here, if you just want to start with the serializer options that gives you the schema preferred settings, then I think it's fine to say we're adding it as part of this proposal. Unless you think there's going to be contention on the name.
There's only so much you can do with these defaults, enums, and mixing and matching isn't particularly easy. I think I need to digest this a bit more before I come with the proposal.
All right, so I'll say it was raised, but it'll come back in a follow-up proposal, if ever. Okay. Schema exporter, no longer extension methods, return JSON object. Exporter options, we got rid of the compatibility mode. Compatibility mode was deleted. Jeremy's too hungry and doesn't care that you're returning a span, which is bad precedent, but he'll get over it. And
why is returning a span bad?
I mean, in this case, like it is gonna always be a live thing. You're not because it's a string. It's not gonna be arbitrary returned memory, and I can't think of when someone would capture it and post-reference it. It's a read-only span instead of a writable span, so I can't come up with the reasons why I don't like it, other than we said don't have span properties, unless you're a ref struct.
I mean, presumably it would otherwise be a string array or an I read-only collection or whatever. I'd prefer read-only span over all those, since this is both efficient and non-mutable.
Is is this just returning a span over like the internal array field it's tracking?
Yeah.
Do we want to say that since the internal array field there is kind of an implementation detail, would we want to say that the lifetime of the span returned by path is tied to the lifetime of the JSON schema exporter context and therefore mark it as unscoped ref?
It could have been an array. It's an array that's been specifically allocated for the particular node being generated. So there's no lifetime concerns. There's no buffer pooling concerns. It's just a mechanism to make this read-only.
Well,
Is there any way to squirrel away the read-only span in this callback, like without unsafe code or something?
No.
If you're making a new array entirely per context and you're not doing a like generate 100 array and just remember you've only filled 3 of them, if you're generating a new array every time, why wouldn't you just return it?
Wait, calling the getter isn't returning a new array each time, is it?
No. So the generator would be allocating a. So the idea is that it would be using a stack of tokens, and every time a callback is being detected, it would do a 2 array to that. Well, it's a list, not a stack, but doesn't matter. It would do a 2 array and feed that to the context struct.
I mean, this
Should we
seems
just
way
return a
safer than.
mutable array?
Well, this seems safer than returning a pooled array. But like, if we're allocating every time, no matter what, then.
Yeah, like
there's no.
I assumed
system
from
text here.
I assumed from this that you started the whole process off with, I don't know, go make an array of 100, and if we exceed 100, I'll make it bigger. And then you were just returning like thingy.slice1, then thingy.slice2, and that basically the array was the same in every one of these is what I was expecting.
No.
And
No, because
Can we return system collections immutable array?
system text JSON doesn't
immutable?
reference mutable collections, unfortunately.
Isn't that one of the default collections? One of the default references?
No, it doesn't reference mutable collections statically. I think it's also a net standard concern as well. Like there's no direct reference to immutable collections in SDJ.
yeah, so I mean, I'm just saying if every instance of JSON schema exporter context is only used for this callback, it's not a multicast delegate. So the only person who's going to see this array is the only person it was ever to arrayed for. Why don't we just give them the array?
I'm lying a bit. It's not just being used to feed the callback. It's also being used to generate a JSON pointer in cases of caching of already generated nodes. But it does actually. So it does actually needs to create a copy every time it visits a particular node because the stack gets mutated and you might want to generate a JSON pointer later on. I think the ideal data structure for kind of this type of traversal would have been an immutable stack, but immutable stacks aren't available in SDJ.
I mean, you can add a package reference.
Do I want to?
Because immutable collections are part of the shared runtime in core, so it would just be adding a package reference for NetFX.
Yeah, sure, but it would also force it on the net standard package, which I wouldn't want to do willy-nilly.
Fair enough.
I mean, this could have been string array. Doesn't matter. It might actually unblock scenario in cases where, users want to capture that array. They might want to have the path escape the scope of the delegate.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that if they really want it to escape, they're probably going to turn it into, the called string.join with a front slash or whatever. But yeah, so I'm just if we're making a new array every time, and we don't actually care that it's immutable, then why don't we just return the array?
Can do.
Does that make you sad, Steve?
Doesn't make me sad. I mean, I'm amused because your opening gambit was the rules say don't return read-only span. The rules also say don't return array.
The rules do also say don't return array, yeah. Because they say, yeah, don't have array properties because nobody understands if they're copy properties or direct properties. So, yeah, I don't care. Tanner, what do you prefer?
We don't care. I like span better.
All right, span it is.
Yeah, me too. It seems safer, unless I missed something, than most of the other options.
It's also
especially if you return.
It's
full
also
span.
faster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our guidance on
No
span
covariance.
properties is don't have a span property unless it is abundantly clear what the lifetime of like blah 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 blah. It's span properties make things complicated, and since this type itself is not mutable, you're not going to invalidate it, so it's probably fine. It's when you have a span property of like what's the current state of the list, and then you call add, and it's like these spans may be unrelated now, so don't.
I think the fact that it's only exposed in a callback kind of makes a difference too, right? Like you can only store things in a closure, which is a reference type, and therefore, yeah, I don't know.
So, all right, I'll add the note. We talked about. That's the part I was trying to avoid. All right. Cool. $40 over. Guess we're having a full-length meeting anyway. All right. Oh, we didn't talk about the fact that it's a new namespace. Do we care that it's a namespace that only has 3 types?
I mean, it's bound to receive more types in the future.
Good to me.
Enjoy your lunch.
Yeah, I have a 1 o'clock meeting, so I don't really get to enjoy lunch.
Sorry about that.
Yep, happens. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I know there was a lot of chat that I didn't directly relay, but I think I captured the gist of it, and I don't know if we're meeting on Thursday. If we do, we do, and if not, we'll see you next Tuesday here at our same .NET time, which will be back to 10 because we don't have our monthly meeting. Same .NET time, same .NET channel, yada yada yada. Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.